Now, real quick before we start, I want to send a huge thank you to the very special viewer of this channel who sent in the Ether 2 for review. Bryce, you kick some ass, buddy. Thank you. Hey guys, I'm Josh Valor, and today we're going to be talking about the Ether 2 from Mr. Speakers. But right before we jump into that, I want to give a little bit of a shout out to a new video series I've started called Audiophile Setup Tours. The first episode was showing off my audiophile setup. The second episode was showing off the viewers and the patrons of my channels. And there will be more in the future, so if you want to check out those videos, they're going to be linked in the description down below. All right, let's go ahead and get to the Mr. Speakers Ether number 2. We're gonna go ahead and start off with some pretty strong compliments about this headphone. One is going to be the build quality. Of any headphone, this is up there with either being close to the best built headphones ever. It's a combination of the weight and the comfort and the material choices that have been used. It's incredibly lightweight. They use these nitinol kind of headbands that it's kind of a really elastic metal that tends to hold its shape and does not bend or snap very easily. Crazy lightweight build. It kind of feels like you're holding the future. Like a headphone from 2050 sent back in time would probably feel like this. And I think by far one of the most impressive features about this is that it's not just light. It's light without feeling cheap or plasticky or like it's gonna fall apart. It doesn't feel like that at all. It feels solid. Like if you've ever picked up like a really high-end carbon fiber bike, like a road bike, and it feels like as strong as steel, but it just doesn't feel like steel. It's kind of light and it's kind of disconcerting at first. That's kind of what this is like. And full compliments to Mr. Speakers for being able to produce something this well built. The headphone strap, which is kind of this cutout leather piece over here, it's all the same as is on the Ether CX. And that was a comfortable headphone for me too. The pads, which I actually have two different types of, one perforated on the inside and one flat on the inside like this one is. It has an ear-shaped cutout. It's fairly deep, but not too deep to where they're too sizely. There's lots of room to move around and breathe for me. The pad material choice is great. The foam material choice inside the pads is great. Build through in and throughout is a win-win. It's 10 out of 10 for build. Now, right before we jump into the sound department, we're gonna take a little bit of a trip back in time, about a year, to RMAF 2018, where I heard the Ether 2s for the very first time. And if you know Z Review and you know DMS and you know me, and you've seen any of our reviews, there's not too much stuff that we always overlap altogether on. But the one thing that we did decide was that these headphones just sounded odd. They didn't really sound like anything else. That didn't mean a good thing, that didn't mean a bad thing. They just kind of sounded weird, and I think the general consensus between all three of us was that they just sounded weird. And after having this and listening to this headphone for quite a few weeks, that assessment hasn't really changed. This is a weird sounding headphone. Now I'm gonna do my best to describe what I'm hearing from this headphone, but there's a certain kind of X factor to it that I can't quite put my hands on. But I have kind of determined that I don't really like it very much, whatever it is. So treble response is actually really nice most of the time. It's quick, it's refreshing, it is fairly detailed, but it's not super highly focused or highly forward. So it's got a little bit of a recession compared to some more active treble headphones. For example, like DT1990s are going to be a lot more forward in the treble than these are. Now I think that's going to leave an overall pleasing sound signature in the treble for the vast amount of people. But the weird thing about the treble is that depending on where you are in that treble range, you're going to be getting different experiences. And I have a couple examples of this. One of my testing songs is Within by Daft Punk. At exactly the 43-second mark, there is a center cymbal, and it's got this strong hit. It's kind of off, it's slightly off center, and then it's got this really long decay. And there's absolutely a ton of information in there, and that can be a really singular and really strong sound depending on what you're listening to. This headphone is not displaying that in a very clear or isolated way or a very focused way, which is what I think that test is really there to provide, is saying like, hey, can this have all these beneficial features? And this headphone, unfortunately, doesn't display any of those beneficial features very well. Now, this is just one example. I do have others, but I think you get the point, and I want to move on for the sake of time. Now, mid-range. There's this kind of overall slight warmth and more almost bloom to the lower mid-range, where the lower mid-range feels really, really thick. But it's also not focused and forward like something like an HD 600 or 660S is, or an LCDX, which is going to be very forward in the vocals and they're going to be kind of tightly compacted. This just feels kind of claustrophobic and boxed in a sense on the vocal department. And that may be emphasized by the slight kind of dip in the upper mid-range for the upper end of vocals, where you don't really feel like they're coming at you quite as prominently as they could. When somebody like Morgan James is just blasting her voice as hard and as high as she can go, it needs to sound like she's blasting her voice as hard and as high as it can go. And with this headphone, it just doesn't provide that raw power and soulful feeling that the upper frequencies of vocals can go. But then on the flip side, it's kind of odd because even with the same singer, like you take a Sam Smith where, you know, he can sing relatively low, not super low, but relatively low. And then he can also sing relatively high. Again, not super high, but relatively high. And he has a very big range, but it's not, you know, on the top and it's not on the bottom. It's just kind of right in the middle, but it's wide. And so his position, even though it's in the same recording, the headphone is displaying kind of this broad, kind of more boxy lower end vocals, and then gets more and more finite and shallower when he goes up into the higher vocals, and it doesn't maintain the same presence. So it kind of switches on you, and that it's weird. Again, odd, hard to explain, but that's the best I can do. Now there's another aspect of this where things like electric guitar are gonna feel really quite forward. It's gonna feel like a lot. But then when you go to another instrument, because of the slight upper range recession and the slight treble recession, there's a group called Kodo, which does a lot of live recordings of drums. Not all of their recordings are the best quality, but some of them are really high quality. And when you're listening to drums like that live, I mean, every time it hits, it's like you're feeling it in your chest. You know, you're feeling that thick slap against your body. And granted, you can't replicate that with headphones, but sometimes it should be a little bit kind of shocking, and it should take you aback by, you know, kind of the power and the sound. And no matter how far I seem to turn this up, it gets loud, but it just doesn't ever seem to have that raw impact that a lot of other headphones can have. And I think that's partially due to the slight recession of the upper mid-range and the treble, matched with the lack of kind of slam from the bass response. We'll talk more about that in just a second here. So I think that could have been done better. Bass response, depending on what you like, is going to be good or bad. I consider the tonality of it to be fairly even. I think it would be representative of what a lot of people would consider to be a neutral or appearing natural bass response. It doesn't have a lot of impact behind it. It doesn't have a lot of slam behind it, so you're not really getting a strong kind of slapping against your ear type of feel that I know a lot of you like, and some of you don't, so that may be a benefit or a detriment depending on how you're looking at it. But overall, I find the bass response to be measured, precise, and detailed, and solid, but not thick. And I think a lot of people, including myself, are gonna prefer something with a little bit more low-end grunt, but this certainly isn't bad. Now, the finish to bass off, there's unfortunately two more things that I don't quite love. The dynamics are really not that great compared to something like an Aria or an LCDX, or really, there's a few other examples of planars in the kind of $500 to $3,000 category that have a lot more, a lot more dynamic range for the bass response than this does. So it doesn't really win any awards there. Now, the second thing with the bass response is that what detail and information is there gets lost very easily with the introduction of higher frequencies. So as soon as you start introducing a singer, there's a noticeable dip in quality in the bass response, which is unfortunate to see. But if you have relatively spread out music, and by spread out, I mean like there's not a whole lot of different instruments and different things going on with the bass response. So think like jazz, or, you know, a singer like Christy Barron, she does a lot of that more soulful style of music. The bass response is very good for those songs. Really quite pleasing, actually. This headphone on that type of relaxed music sounds awesome, especially with the comfort and lightweight nature of it. It's really enjoyable to listen to for certain genres, for certain singers. Okay, so imaging and soundstage. Imaging is good at the upper end of frequencies, and then like we talked about with the vocals, it actually loses a little bit of focus and a little bit of singularity, especially with the vocals, the lower and lower in frequency you get. And that is natural because a lot of headphones will do that, but it seems to be more a rapid descension than other flagship headphones that I've tried. Now soundstage, and this is one of the more odd aspects to this headphone, and I think one of the things that I couldn't quite put my finger on at the event, and now with the amount of time I spent on this, I can pinpoint it a little bit more precisely. But this headphone almost sounds miniature. It's hard to explain because you feel like it soundstages naturally. Like there is a sound stage that it presents and it represents. It's not the best at doing that. It's not the worst at doing that. It's fairly good. But it just doesn't feel big. It doesn't feel vast. It kind of just feels like you take, that singular, focus point in the center, and then you have these like different levels to the soundstage, but it's all just compacted and kind of happening all right here. And it's not like an intimate sound like a 6XX, for example, is going to be like an intimate sound where you've got very focused things happening here and then other things. And it kind of sounds like you are listening to the microphone's position in the room. This kind of sounds like you're in the room. It's just a small box happening right in front of you. It's very odd. It's kind of hard to explain. I'm not sure if that makes any sense at all to anybody but me, but that's the best way that I can articulate it. So I'm sorry if that doesn't make any sense to you. Now, one more downside with the sound staging is that even though, placement is fairly good, when there's a lot of stuff happening, it tends to lose a lot of the separation and a lot of the instrument and singer focus that it can have. And when it does have it, it's very clear. But when things get more complicated and when there's more stuff coming in and stuff going out and sounds happening over here and here and here and closer and farther, the more stuff you throw at it, the worse and worse the performance tends to get, and it doesn't scale up with the complexity of the music. So, conclusion time, and I have a couple thoughts before I present my kind of finalizing statements here. This headphone for me is kind of getting hit from two different fronts. One is going to be the personal bias side of just what I prefer and the sound signature that I like, and my reviews are kind of a mixture of a more objective analysis and a more subjective analysis of what I like. And I put in little notes here and there where I say, just to my preferences, this doesn't meet it. And this headphone does not fit my preferences. And the second part is that more objective analysis of the headphone, like that Within song from Daft Punk. It's like, well, yeah, I may have my preference on what I like to hear more, but I can definitely analyze what has more detail, what has more separation, how long that decay lasts, how forward it is, what the placement is like. That stuff I can objectively analyze and say, okay, A headphone is better than B headphone, and B headphone is better than C headphone, or whatever it happens to be. And on both the personal side and the more objective side, this headphone just doesn't stack up for me. Another thought I have when the performance is really not this good is that, this could be a dud, but unfortunately, since I don't work with a lot of companies, I work with people sending in products for review, which I'm incredibly grateful for because it allows me to say whatever the fuck I want, and that's awesome. But I am stuck in the bubble where I do have to work with what I get, and I don't too often get multiple examples of headphones, especially not headphones that cost $2,000. Now, speaking of headphones that cost $2,000, when it comes to headphones that are kind of in the flagship range, which I kind of determine, like it starts at $1,000 for flagships and then just goes up. You have everything from, HC800s to LC4s. And to be one of those headphones that gets a recommendation from me, it either has to be better than good at everything. By everything, I mean everything. It has to be able to do dynamics, separation, soundstage, this, that, or the other thing really, really well. And it has to do all of it to get a recommendation from me. Or it has to do maybe one or two things better than anything else in the market. For example, HC800s, I'm not a huge personal fan of them as an overall headphone, but if you want soundstage, that's pretty much the best soundstaging that you can get for around $1,000. So when people ask for, pure raw soundstaging of the headphones that I've heard, that's my recommendation because it's good at that one particular thing, or better than most other things in that price range. It's good at that thing, so it gets my recommendation for that. The Ether 2 just doesn't have that thing. Which is disappointing to see because the build quality is just exceptional. Now, if it sounded as good as it looks and is built, it'd be a great recommendation. It's just not. So this headphone for me is something that I mean, if you hear it and you like it, that's great. You know, take your opinion over mine in those circumstances. But if you're trying to base a purchase decision off of me, I would say definitely skip this one, and I'll leave some other options in the description down below. All right, guys, I think that's gonna wrap it up. Thank you again, Bryce, for sending this out. I really appreciate it, dude.